Welcome everybody, good morning. I'm Rebecca, I'm part of the events team here at the Chamber, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Bringing Back Business, the Safe Return to Work. The format of the event, we'll be doing the Q&A at the end, so if you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat box or raise your hand and we'll come to you at the end. In today's session, we're going to be looking at a range of health and safety and HR issues relating to working from home and the return to the workplace. For many, working from home is the new normal for the foreseeable, with the UK government having reported nearly 6 in 10 those currently working at home believe they will be doing so till at least 2021, with 12% expecting to work from home indefinitely. The workplace as a concept and a landscape is very different to what we knew it to be at the start of 2020. Remote working, either fully or in part, has opened up a lot of opportunities for businesses and their people. However, it cannot be ignored that it may bring new challenges. It is because of these considerations that today's event, delivered by Bonomy and Francis Ross from global law firm Clyde Co, is important in supporting businesses to navigate through this period of change. So it's without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Francis to start this discussion.
Thank you very much for joining us today. As Rebecca said, I'm Francis Ross and I'm a partner in the employment team at Clyde Co, and I'm joined by Bonomy, a senior associate in our safety, health and environmental regulatory team. I certainly now feel like I can't remember a time when we didn't start sessions like today by saying something like we're living in challenging times, but unfortunately it's true, and what is particularly difficult for businesses is the uncertainty. What's going to happen to the R number, how that will affect your workforce, when government restrictions will be lifted or increased. But many of you will be seeking to operate as close to normally as possible, whether in the workplace or with a remote workforce, or possibly a mix of the two. So this morning we're going to highlight some of the key legal considerations for employers at this time. I'm going to begin by looking at things from an employment law perspective, and then Anne will move on to look at the question of health and safety. We're going to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes and leave time at the end for questions. So please do share any thoughts or questions that you have. I'm going to cover two main areas. One is the government support for employers at this time, which is may well be relevant regardless of where your workforce are working at the moment. And then also looking at the question of specifically returning to work as and when that happens, and the particular groups of employees that you may need to be thinking about, being the vulnerable, the self-isolating, the quarantining, and those who are reluctant to return. So this Saturday sees the end of the coronavirus job retention scheme, or the furlough scheme as it was more commonly known. Furlough being one of the many terms that overnight have become part of our everyday language, along with social distancing, self-isolating, lockdown, PPE, and some others which I came across, which may not be in everyday usage, but I felt certainly helped capture this moment in time. These include Corona Coaster, which is the emotional roller coaster that is the pandemic. Quarantinis, the cocktails that you've been producing using whatever you have in the house, because obviously purchasing cocktail ingredients wouldn't be essential shopping. Locktail hour, formerly known as wine o'clock. Also furlough Merlot, a way of passing the time on furlough. Blue Skype thinking, obviously video brainstorming. Coronials, the generation unfortunately born into the pandemic. Blur's Day, which I think is the one I can relate to most, when you can't remember what day it is because every day is the same. And Zoom bombing, which hopefully we're going to avoid today. So it was back in March that the furlough scheme was launched to protect jobs as the nation went into lockdown. I doubt that anyone appreciated in March that such a high level of support would still be required by October. I won't go into a lot of detail about this scheme because it ends on Saturday, but it's useful just to note for comparison purposes how responsibility for payment of employee salaries was split. Initially, the government met 80% of salaries up to a cap, and employers could decide whether to top that up to 100% or not. But laterally, the employer contribution was increased in stages up to 20%, with the government paying 60%, again, subject to the cap. There's been two new schemes announced in the past 2 weeks, and which one applies to your organisation depends on the level of restrictions to which your business is subject, and presumably the area in which you're operating. First of all, we have the job support scheme for businesses which are forced to close by government restrictions, known as Tier 3 in England, and from the looks of things, probably levels 3 and 4 in Scotland, according to the framework that was announced on Friday. This scheme is known as the Job Support Scheme Closed, and employees will receive 2/3 of their normal pay, subject to a cap of £2,083.33, which is fully funded by the government. The employer has to pay national insurance and pension contributions, and can choose to top that up to 100% or somewhere between the 67% and 100%. But there must be written agreement between the employer and the employees agreeing to this change to the employees' normal terms and conditions. The second scheme coming into effect on the 1st of November is the Job Support Scheme Open, which, as the name suggests, is for businesses that can remain open but are facing reduced demand. The aim of this scheme is to keep viable jobs by agreeing with employees that they will work fewer hours and accept a pay reduction. As you can see from this diagram, the scheme is quite a bit more complicated, but in essence, employees have to work for a minimum of 20% of their contracted hours, which is a reduction from the original proposal when this scheme was first announced in September, when it was said that employees would have to work a minimum of a third of their normal hours, but it's now 20%. So for a full-time employee, that would be 1 day a week, and their employer pays their normal pay for those hours. The employer then pays for 5% of the hours, the employee's normal hours that they aren't working, capped at £125 per month, plus employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions on all payments that the employee receives. So that, in essence, equates to 4% of the employee's total hours if the employee works the minimum 20%. And then the government pays 61.67% of the hours that are not worked. And again, this is increased from the original announcement of a third. That's capped at £1,541.75. And so that will equate to 49% of employees' total pay. This means that employees who are earning up to £3,125 per month, which is the monthly reference pay that the government uses, they'll take home at least 73% of their pay for working a minimum of 20% of their hours. Again, written agreement is required. It's been confirmed that training counts as work for the minimum hours of work required. So that may help some employers where there's little work to be done, that they could perhaps be using that time to upskill their employees. For both schemes, the employees must have been on the payroll on or before the 23rd of September, and they do not have to have been furloughed under the furlough scheme previously. Employees who have left after the 23rd of September, so may have been made redundant after that date, can be rehired and placed on one of these schemes, and employees can be moved on and off the schemes in blocks of 7 days. It's interesting that the guidance issued at the end of last week confirmed that employers can top up beyond the minimum proportions provided for under the scheme, because it was initially stated that the schemes were only expected to be used by employers that were not in a position to top up salaries. All SMEs are eligible, and potentially large businesses if their turnover has fallen due to COVID-19, which will be assessed according to their VAT returns. The government has said that it discourages large businesses from claiming under the schemes if they are making capital distributions, such as paying dividends. But the latest guidance makes clear that they're not prohibiting that, but rather they're encouraging businesses to reflect on their responsibilities, noting that taxpayers should be able to rely on public money only being claimed where it is clearly needed. So that's another change, because originally it was indicated that the expectation would be that large businesses making capital distributions would not access the scheme. But now we know that that's not being prohibited. Employers will be making their claims in arrears for salary that they've already paid, and the first claims can be made from the 8th of December via an online portal. It's not permitted for employers to make claims for employees who have been made redundant or are serving their notice period. The good news is that employers claiming under either scheme can still claim under the job retention bonus scheme, which provides that employers can claim £1,000 per employee that they have furloughed and then kept employed until the 31st of January 2021. The schemes are going to run until April 2021, but be reviewed in January. And we're told that there'll be more guidance issued at the end of this month, which is obviously cutting it fine given that they come into effect on Sunday. But it'll be useful to see what that says. The key point, if you're planning on using either of these new schemes, is that you need to be putting in place the agreements with employees in respect to the reduction of their working hours and pay, and do that now. You may previously have had furlough agreements, but it's unlikely that those are going to be sufficient for the purposes of the new schemes. So you'll need to seek fresh agreements with your staff. Moving on from the support schemes, I wanted to look at some of the groups of employees you may be encountering as part of your return to or continued operations. Obviously, on the 23rd of March, we were all told to stay at home in stark terms. And naturally, that results in some employees being anxious about the idea of returning to their workplace. In fact, in Scotland, government guidance remains that those who can work remotely should do so. But there will inevitably be some who cannot do their job remotely, and they are permitted to continue to attend work. So the first group that I wanted to consider are what we would call vulnerable employees. These are the individuals for whom COVID presents a particularly high risk because of underlying health conditions, age, pregnancy, possibly ethnicity. And many of this group will have been shielding during lockdown until that was paused on the 1st of August. For employees who are classed as vulnerable, the government advice is particularly to allow them to work from home if they can. And that may involve adjustments to their role or duties to accommodate that. And I'll look at the statutory obligation to consider such adjustments in a moment. If they can't work from home, to protect yourself against claims, it's recommended that you do a risk assessment for the particular employee and consider what steps can be taken to mitigate the risk. And I know that Anne's going to talk a bit more about risk assessment shortly. You should talk to employees about steps that have been taken to make the workplace safe. For example, screens being put in place, wearing of masks, having plenty of hand sanitizer, ensuring social distancing in order to allay any unfounded fears that they may have. But it's also important to be sensitive and understanding, because it will be particularly concerning for those who were advised to shield, particularly as the prevalence of the virus in the community continues to rise. You'll need to think about your options if the employee simply refuses to return to work, and I'll come on to those in a minute when talking about reluctant returnees. And also consider the discrimination risks, because many vulnerable employees will be disabled, some may be ethnic minority, and therefore subject to particular protections under the Equality Act. So if you're considering taking steps such as placing them on unpaid leave or dismissing them, that could be seen as unfavourable treatment supporting a discrimination claim, and therefore it would be wise to take advice. I mentioned the statutory duty to make adjustments. This applies to disabled employees. And given that many vulnerable employees will meet the definition of disability under the Equality Act, in that they have a physical or mental condition which has a long-term adverse effect on their ability to do day-to-day activities, especially the clinically extremely vulnerable, it will be necessary to consider the statutory obligation to make reasonable adjustments. This duty applies where there's a provision, criterion or practice or physical feature or an absence of auxiliary aids which puts disabled employees at a substantial disadvantage compared to persons who are not disabled. Reasonable adjustments in the current context could include allowing the individual to work from home or to continue working from home, amending their duties so that they can do this, or if they have to be in the workplace, allocating them to duties or locations where they are going to be at the lowest risk. So for example, that might be roles that are not customer facing, or as a minimum ensuring that they have all appropriate PPE. We then have self-isolating employees. These are those employees who either are isolated for 10 days because they themselves have COVID symptoms or have tested positive. Those who are isolated for 14 days because they're living with someone or in an extended household with someone who's isolating due to having COVID symptoms or a positive test. Someone who's been directed to isolate by test and trace, or someone who's isolating for 14 days ahead of having surgery. All the individuals in this group would be entitled to statutory sick pay throughout their absence from work, assuming that they are unable to work. They must not be asked to attend work before their isolation period expires. And in fact, the Scottish Government issued a joint statement with the STUC on fair work expectations in July, which said that no worker should be financially penalised for following medical advice and not attending work, which doesn't mean they have to receive full pay, but that they should not be denied sick pay. That COVID-19 related absences should not affect future sick pay entitlement, and that such absences should not result in attendance related warnings or be taken into account in absence management figures. Now, this is, as I say, a joint statement. It's not a legal requirement except where it already reflects the law, such as the obligation to pay statutory sick pay, but it is being advocated as good practice. Then turning to quarantining employees, anyone returning from outside the common travel area, which is the UK, Ireland, Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, has to quarantine for 14 days unless they're coming from an exempt country or territory or they work in an exempt sector. I imagine that not many of us have been much further away than Troon or North Berwick this year, but some have ventured further afield and would now be doing so with the known risk that the country they're visiting may fall off the exemption list whilst they're away. That may not be a huge issue if the employee is working from home anyway and can continue to do so. But problems do arise if the employee can't work from home and then has to quarantine for 2 weeks. They aren't entitled to statutory sick pay unless during that time they start showing symptoms or having a positive test. So what they're entitled to will come down to your organisation's policies. In my experience, most employers are permitting the use of annual leave or unpaid leave. But employers are encouraged to think about if they impose, if there's significant consequences for employees of having to quarantine, that raises the risk that they will simply breach the requirement to quarantine and attend work anyway. So that's something to factor in when considering how to deal with this situation. And it's why many employers are taking the option of allowing employees to use additional annual leave. And then the group that I call reluctant returnees, those employees who don't have to self-isolate or quarantine, but are concerned about returning to their workplace. And so the first question is, can you as the employer insist that they return to work? The starting point is that employees are obliged to comply with lawful and reasonable instructions. It's unlikely to be considered lawful and reasonable if the employee can work from home, particularly given the Scottish Government guidance, and particularly if they're vulnerable. And it certainly won't be lawful or reasonable if the employee should be self-isolating or quarantining. If the employee can't work from home, then it would be important to understand the reason for their resistance to see if it's legitimate for the employee to refuse to comply with the instruction, because the Employment Rights Act provides specific protections against unfair dismissal or being subject to a detriment, where the reason for resistance is concerns about safety, or if it's because the employee has blown the whistle about health and safety concerns. So just looking at that in a bit more detail, an employee will be protected from dismissal or being subject to detriment if in circumstances of danger, which the employee reasonably believed to be serious and imminent, he or she could not reasonably be expected to avert the danger and they left, proposed to leave or refused to return to their workplace or any part of it, or they took or proposed to take appropriate steps to protect themselves or others from the danger. It's a key point here that it's the employee's reasonable belief that's relevant, not the employer's reasonable belief or even the reality of the situation. It's probably not going to be difficult for employees to show that the danger of COVID-19 is serious and imminent. If we remember the slide I had with the picture of Boris Johnson telling us to stay at home on the 23rd of March, he described COVID-19 as an invisible killer and the biggest threat that the country had faced for decades. And if an employee highlights to you that they believe anyone's health and safety is being endangered or is likely to be endangered, that will constitute a protected disclosure and therefore bring them within the protection under the whistleblowing provisions of the Employment Rights Act also. So what are the consequences of these types of claims under the Employment Rights Act? Well, the first point is that we are hearing that there has been a spike in these types of claims already, and we expect there to be more. There's no minimum service requirement. So whereas, for example, for an employee to claim unfair dismissal, usually you have to have employed them for 2 years or more, an employee could raise these types of claims on day one of their employment. The compensation isn't capped in any way, and it can include compensation for injury to feelings as well as for financial loss. And an employer who's deemed to be responding unreasonably to concerns that an employee has raised may also face the risk of constructive dismissal claims also. So how as an employer do you manage these risks? First of all, you need to establish what the employee's concerns are in order to decide whether they're reasonable. I always suggest an employer asks an employee to confirm their concerns in writing so that there isn't a dispute later on as to whether or not they flagged a particular issue. Then employers should do what they can to address the concerns and record what steps they've taken to do so. It's wise to confirm to the employee again in writing what steps have been taken to address their concerns, because it's less likely to be reasonable for the employee to have a belief in serious and imminent danger if you can prove that you told them of all the steps that you'd taken to make their workplace COVID safe. Share your risk assessments with them so that they understand, again, that the appropriate precautions have been taken. And then you need to decide whether any ongoing belief that the employee has in their serious and imminent danger is likely to be deemed reasonable or not. If it's not, you have an employee who doesn't want to come to work, you could consider whether to use the job support scheme or allow the employee to take annual leave or unpaid leave. But if you think that it is reasonable for them to have that continued belief, but there just isn't anything more that you can reasonably do, then again, you would think about whether you could use the job support scheme, whether you could facilitate the employee continuing to work from home, whether that's by undertaking a different role or different duties, or perhaps allowing them to take paid leave, given the risk of the types of claims that I've described, if you were to subject them to any adverse consequences as a result of their refusal to return. So that's covered all the points I wanted to cover. I'm now going to hand over to Anne to tell you about what an employer's responsibilities are in terms of getting its workplace back to the office.
Thank you, Frances. I'm just going to see that. Thank you. I think that's worked, hopefully. Well, good morning, everyone. I am a solicitor with Clyde Co. I specialise in accidents and incidents which ultimately result in some sort of harm, but specifically when those accidents and investigations result in prosecutions. Most of the work that I do revolves around health and safety, whether it be a collapsing crane, crashing helicopters, but could also be dealing with investigations of outbreaks such as E. coli, Legionella, and now COVID. I have been specialising in health and safety work for the past 15 years or so, and in that time, the manner in which investigations are carried out has become much more sophisticated, and that's by both the health and safety executive and environmental health. But in turn, the manner in which businesses manage health and safety in the workplace has also improved and developed, and most businesses now understand the importance of managing risk as a means of minimising exposure to claims, that be a personal injury claim or an employment dispute, and so on. What we have now, however, is an additional layer of pressure on employers to take account of the current global pandemic, and in particular how their business is going to respond to that. The stresses and strains now in businesses are contorted in such a way that the focus has shifted into all sorts of areas which previously were taken for granted. For example, simply travelling to work or entering an office building sitting at a desk and doing your job, or going to the factory to do your job, and so on and so forth. But the economy needs to continue, so we have to find a way to allow business to continue. So the purpose of what I'm going to talk about today is to provide some background in relation to what's expected of a business getting back to work, but also what might happen if a business fails to comply with its expectations, if anything. Everyone will no doubt be aware that business activities have to be risk assessed, and that requirement comes from the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. That risk assessment requires to be suitable and sufficient, and should demonstrate that a proper check was made. It follows, therefore, that the risk assessment in returning to work in a COVID environment is an essential focal point of any business. It may well be that businesses carrying out COVID risk assessments are doing so in a much more detailed way than previous risk assessments. So some statistics: in April 2020, 50% of employees were working from home. 90% were working from home because of the COVID-19 outbreak. And this inevitably meant that employers had to think quickly as to how they might make arrangements for flexible working for their employees. Now, 6 months down the line, quite clearly, COVID-19 is very much still a prevalent threat. So how can we get back to the office? So what are employers' duties? The overarching legal document is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, and that requires an employer to provide a safe working environment for employees. This is essentially the catch-all provision in health and safety legislation. It's possible to prosecute under various regulations, such as work at height and so on, but by and large, prosecuting authorities can use the Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act to prosecute any harm that has been sustained in the workplace. As a result of that, therefore, the HSE consider that this is sufficient to catch any COVID-19 failures. So what are the employer's duties? Well, by way of background, if an employee sustains injury at work, and that could be contracting a disease, then the onus is on the employer to demonstrate that they took all reasonably practicable steps to prevent that harm. It is not a council of excellence. It is the reasonable employer has to take reasonable steps to prevent this harm. Now, the concept that underpins risk assessment is that a two-stage process. What must be considered in the first place are all causes or potential causes of harm. But the second stage, which is important, is that they must consider the likelihood of that harm arising. Now, there could be a situation whereby a serious harm could be caused. For example, I have in mind asbestosis. The cause or the potential cause of that harm is high. However, the likelihood of that materialising into a disease is low, which brings down the risk factor, for example. So what does an employer need to do to ensure that safe working environment? Risks associated with COVID-19 are to be treated like any other risk to health and safety. So that inevitably means that there are not only duties on the employer, but also duties on employees. And it's important to recognise that the employees have a duty to ensure that the business is safe as well. So in that regard, any information given to employees needs to be clear and unequivocal. One of the main features of COVID-19 environment is that there is a consultation with the workplace, and from the standpoint of obtaining their comments and opinions on a proposed strategy, but also to provide them with information in relation to what you're doing as an employer in the current climate. I would suggest that it cannot be underestimated how important the provision of information and consultation, engagement with staff can be in ensuring that you protect your own business from risk. And I think that ties in with what Francis was saying earlier about employees' perception of the risk within the workplace. From a purely human point of view, and setting aside any legal requirement to carry out the risk assessment, employees are now working in an entirely new way and often in an isolated and stressful environment. Contact from their employer, even on an infrequent basis, could be enough to demonstrate a care and interest in the workforce. That in itself could be very useful in mitigating other risks, and I'll turn to some of those risks shortly. But no doubt you'll be aware that there's a huge amount of information on the internet, whether it be government websites or the HSE website and so on. But it would seem from my analysis and looking at the documentation that there are 7 key steps to think about when returning to the workplace. So, as I've said, consulting the workforce, so working from home, or WFH, is the Marmite of 2020. Some people love it, some people hate it. And the only way to find out is to ask them. So there's different ways of doing this, whether it be to pick up the phone, depends on the size of your workforce, whether it be to email them or carry out surveys. Whatever, it is imperative that you do something and that you inform them of the discussions that you're having and the decisions that you're making in relation to their return to work. Step 2. This is the major step, conducting the workplace risk assessment. This will be the foundation of your plan and will allow you to identify the hazards in relation to returning to work. Like I've said, there's various examples of style risk assessments on the HSE website, but this should be a live document which is being constantly revisited. We're seeing the requirements changing on an almost daily basis at the moment. But I mentioned before, the purpose of the risk assessment is to identify a cause or potential cause of harm and the likelihood of that harm occurring. Third step, conduct individual risk assessment, and this again consistent with what Francis was saying about vulnerable individuals. You have to consider these individuals and consider doing bespoke risk assessments for those individuals. Of course, you first of all have to identify those individuals, and it may not be obvious whether someone is vulnerable or not. So again, keeping in contact with the workforce is imperative. Next step is to look at the working environment, and I know that almost all businesses are doing this at the moment. You'll need to consider whether any adaptations are required to the workplace. Our offices are currently undergoing refurbishment. I know that a number of businesses are looking for alternative premises, if premises at all now. You have to consider the touch points and ways to control risks of hot desking. Should there be shared use of desks? Should there be a booking system in place for the use of desks? What's the cleaning regime in relation to passing workstations from one person to another? And in that regard, then the cleaning and hygiene procedures are very important. Obviously, maintaining social distancing and managing transmission risks. Any other sorts of considerations? I mentioned earlier that we now have to factor in just getting to work or walking into the office, going up the stairs, coming down the lift. So do we stagger start and stop times and splitting the workforce into different groups to ensure that there's continuity in the business if somebody in one team is off, to ensure that there is somebody else if there's isolating and so on. Look at the workplace environment. Are there ways to set it up? Some people I know are setting their workplace up a bit like a school where everybody's facing forwards, or in diagonal workforces and so on. I suppose there's an opportunity here to be creative. Step 5 is to review any existing policies that you have in place. And this could be quite an undertaking, I suppose, but again, ensure that all policies and procedures are updated to reflect the current environment, to reflect COVID-19. Now, the COVID-19 outbreaks are RIDDOR reportable, so that must be taken into account as well. If somebody suffers from COVID-19 as a result of exposure in the workplace, then that requires to be reported. Perhaps consideration of an outbreak plan to deal with any instances of infection, and also perhaps when you might require legal support in that regard. Ensure that the business continuity plan is up to date, and also consideration of data protection procedures. People might be taking documents out of the office, people might be storing numbers of files at home. This has to be considered, and again, you have to make your workforce aware of their obligations in that regard. You also have to look at the emergency evacuation and accident response. If you've got your workforce in the 5th floor of a building, what happens when the fire alarm goes off? And this is a case of competing risks. So you would just have to look at how you ensure everyone knows what they're doing in that regard. And of course, provide training. As soon as you update something, as soon as you review something, then you need to inform your workforce and educate them in relation to that. So, continuation of part-time working from home. As I said earlier, some people enjoy working from home, some people find it very, very difficult. And there are a number of additional considerations that might have to be made at this time. Tied up in the provision of information to the workforce, it's my experience that a lack of information can be problematic. It encourages criticism of the boss or the management team, and it leads to a lack of confidence from the workforce. And a huge issue in relation to this pandemic is how it has affected mental health. And there's no doubt there's been an increased focus on mental health as a result, and this is obviously justified. You might have identified as vulnerable who maybe requires extra assistance may well get that assistance because they're already on your radar. But I would encourage you as employers to consider how mental health can be affected as a result simply of working from home. On those perhaps who you wouldn't recognise as having vulnerabilities at all. And again, the only way to ascertain this is to ask the question. There's a number of emotions experienced from working at home, depending on circumstances. Some people don't have appropriate workspaces. There's a balancing of childcare and home working, but also balancing sharing a working environment with a working partner, which can itself be difficult and problematic as well. I would suggest that possibly a large part of the workforce could potentially have their current working environment improved by simple engagement with them and an offer of support, or for perhaps even an offer of some additional time off or time allocated to them in an office environment. A large insurer recently gave everybody a Friday off in the last couple of weeks just to recognise the difficulties of working from home, and that was received very well by the workforce. And it's these small gestures that can make an enormous difference to people. Again, this is not a one-way street. There are as many duties on the employees as there are on the employers. We're constantly being reminded by the government what our duties are, and these are no different in the workplace. They need to be reminded that they have to adhere to the COVID-19 advice. This is an overarching advice. If they have symptoms, or family members do, they have to stay at home. If they've been in the office, they need to report their symptoms for track and trace. And employees have a duty to follow any procedures and policies that you as an employer put in place. They need to understand what those policies and procedures are. So what is actually being done to monitor any changes that are being made, or to investigate how businesses are carrying out these risk assessments? The answer to that is not a great deal. I engage with the Health and Safety Executive regularly, normally in relation to workplace accidents. And I recently was speaking to a senior member of the Health and Safety Executive to find out exactly how they're dealing with it. It's very much a response-based service at the moment. There is a COVID team set up by the HSE. There is a COVID response call centre, which basically relies on whistleblowers or concerned employees who will provide information. Now, that exists already within HSE. They often rely on people phoning in, perhaps have walked past a building site and seen some dangerous scaffolding, and they'll get a phone call and the HSE will investigate that. That in the past would have normally resulted in an inspector attending the premises. As you might imagine, and simply by virtue of the fact that they have established a call centre, they are obviously receiving a number of calls in relation to concerns, whether it be employees or members of the public. And my understanding is that that is followed up by initially a phone call. And at the moment, what they really want to do is upskill businesses. So if somebody has failed to carry out the risk assessment, then they will assist them in ensuring that they get that in place, because of the massive pressure that's on all bodies at the moment. But they don't have the power the manpower to enter businesses and start issuing improvement notices in relation to a failure to have these risk assessments in place. We really are trying to assist businesses, as my understanding, as far as possible. If, however, and the possibility is that if there was an investigation and it was serious enough, that the powers of the HSE would be that they could enter the premises and they could serve an improvement notice or a prohibition notice on the work that's being carried out within the business. But the question, I think, or an important question to ask is, well, what's the likelihood of a prosecution? They have to be able to associate the harm with the risk. And to my mind, that's going to be quite a difficult task. In the legal sense, how do you prove that an employee who tests positive contracted the virus as a result of the workplace? That in itself is going to be very difficult, particularly as the cases rise. In my suggestion to you, the duty of the employer is to carry out the risk assessment, take reasonably practicable steps, do all that is reasonably practicable. And as long as that process is documented and disseminated within the business, then the duty on the employer is discharged. In other words, I would suggest do not fear prosecution, but simply having a sense of accountability to the staff is the important factor. And in that regard, I don't think you can be wrong. So, just in summary, as a business, ensure that risk assessments are updated, or indeed fresh risk assessments are carried out. Ensure that policies and procedures are updated. Listen to your employees, engage with them and keep them up to date with what's going on. That will have a huge effect on minimising complaints or potentially claims. Monitor and review the COVID-19 safe systems of work in line with government guidelines. Also, we have local restrictions that need to be considered, which is problematic as well. The failure to do so will be a breach of health and safety law, but demonstrating that you've taken the reasonable steps will be a defence. So that's all that I have to say, and I understand that there's an opportunity for questions if anybody has any questions.
Perfect, thank you so much, Anne and Francis. That was such a clear and thorough talk through as to the employer's obligations as well as the employees. As you mentioned, and this is something that we've not come across before, so everyone's kind of in the same boat trying to navigate landscape. So thank you so much for helping us navigate it. Does anyone have any questions for Anne and Francis to kick off? No, I'll start with one if no one wants to. This might be a bit of a difficult question, so sorry if I'm starting off with a hard one. If businesses decide not to return to the workplace and to continue working remotely, what obligations does the employer therefore have? Because as you mentioned, some employees might be reluctant to return to work, but also some employees might be reluctant to stay at home. And also in terms of when the employee started, they obviously didn't sign up for things that like they're having to take on as part of working from home. So for instance, they're having to use their own electricity bills and their own maybe devices and stuff. So what obligations are employers, needing to support their staff if they do decide to continue to work from home for the foreseeable?
Yeah, I'll maybe start with that, and Anne can add anything that she also wants to contribute from a health and safety perspective, but certainly from an employment law perspective, we saw overnight, obviously, the workforce, the national workforce being sent home in a way that wasn't really consistent with their contracts of employment, which will have said that their place of work was their employer's office or premises. And I think everybody accepted that because there really was no alternative, and obviously the safety was the priority. As time has passed, I imagine there are employees who are questioning what measures their employer has in place to support them as they continue to work from home. Because what was feasible on a temporary basis becomes perhaps less feasible when it's looked at being continued for an indefinite further period. So there are certain obligations that employers should have been considering from the outset in terms of their employees' health and safety. And again, Anne's better placed to advise on that than I am, but there's still obligations to carry out risk assessments for employees working from home. Employers have responsibilities for their employees' physical and mental well-being. So employers would be well advised to all along have been engaging with their staff regularly to assess whether there's anybody who's having particular difficulties, and then trying to take steps to address that. In terms of people having appropriate working environments, that's obviously a challenge because many people they didn't make their living arrangements on the basis that they would be working at home for 6 or 8 months full time. And if there's multiple people trying to work in a single household, that is also a particular challenge. There's no, as a general rule, there's no specific obligation on an employer to meet an employee's costs to enable them to work from home. If assuming that the employee wants to work from home, if it's their choice to do that, then there's no obligation on an employer to meet the additional costs of their energy bills or a particular style of desk or space to work, because the employer can say, well, I've got a perfectly adequate working environment for you in our office, and if you're choosing not to use that, then that's your choice. At the moment, we're in a situation where employers would probably say, well, we don't want you to work from home either. It's the government that's saying that you have to work from home. So I would say it's a bit of a grey area. And I don't think that many employers are contributing to employees' costs at the moment. I think as there's more scope for employees to return, if some employers are saying, actually, we do want you to continue to work from home, then there are going to have to be those types of negotiations and discussions about who's going to foot the bill for that. And there may be already an obligation on employers, given that employees have been working at home for so long, to be looking at providing the appropriate equipment to make sure that their employees' health and safety is not being compromised. That might be a good time to bring Anne in on those types of points.
I mean, in terms of health and safety, I think the word reasonable precautions is used an awful lot, and Francis is right, we're in a very grey area at the moment, and I think happily from my point of view, I get to hang my hat on just basically, is this a reasonable step that's being taken? And everything that has to be done has to be a reasonable. Now, what's reasonable in the eyes of an employee and what's reasonable in the eyes of the law can often be very different. I mean, I'm sure there are a number of people who are having conversations with friends at the moment who'll be saying, you know, I have to carry out my job from City, and the reply to that is, well, that's entirely unreasonable. I think anything going forwards, if a business decided to basically shut its doors and say you're all working from home, and by the way, there are a number of businesses doing that, large businesses are doing that, then they're going to have to take reasonable steps to ensure that their employees' workplace is safe, and whatever that means. Now, then the employer has to take into account it's cost effective for us to close our office doors, but what is the cost of ensuring that your employees' home office working space is safe? And some people, for example, don't have a home office working space. In the part of your question, I think, related to cost, and I can't answer that, but there was something on Martin Lewis's money saving expert programme the other week about that specific question. And there is provision, I think, to make claims in relation to tax and so on and rebates. But these are bigger questions, and I have no doubt that that's a developing area of law, and that that questions are going to be raised by employees. At the moment, we're all still very much treading water in relation to this situation, but there will come a point where people will say this, enough's enough and I'm not willing to put up with this, and then we'll start to see the arguments. And only when the arguments develop do we start to see where the law lies and what is reasonable and what is not.
Thank you.
To answer your question.
No, I understand that this is a difficult time to get definite answers, so thank you for both for your contribution. We've got a question in the chat from Callum Howie. Is there legal enforcement behind the tier system? For example, if we were in tier 0 and held a public event, the restriction increased and the public events were no longer allowed, could we be found liable, even if we had taken every reasonable step, such as private testing, etc.?
Goodness, I don't actually know the answer to that. I mean, and if whether or not there is legal enforcement, I would be reluctant to say just taking reasonable steps would be enough. I don't know, Francis, if you know the answer to that.
I'm not sure if that's clear yet. I think throughout, there's always been a bit of ambiguity as to what actually there was a statutory basis for and what was simply guidance. There obviously have been some regulations issued that have made certain things law, and other things have just been framed as guidance. And so I think that will be the deciding factor as to the consequences if you do something that's contrary to what's provided for in the new framework. So I think we'll have to see in the coming days as the framework comes into force whether there are regulations issued to support it, or the extent to which I suppose they're relying on people's goodwill to adhere to the guidance.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much for Anne and Francis for that really insightful and helpful discussion. This is a really confusing new time for us all, so it's very much appreciated that you took the time to break everything down and help make it a little bit clearer and everyone feel a little bit safer going through this process. So thank you everyone for attending. Hope you have a lovely rest of your week, and hope to see you all again soon.